Forest Ranger. Jake Mitchell's weathered hands froze mid-reach for his radio, his eyes locked on the massive black bear beside him as Bruno suddenly erupted into a bone-chilling roar that echoed through the Rocky Mountain checkpoint. The 400-pound bear's hackles bristled like daggers as he clawed frantically at an unmarked black suitcase sitting innocently in the back of a well-dressed stranger's SUV. Something inside that case was alive. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's medical bag crashed to the ground as she witnessed Bruno's unprecedented reaction, her 20 years of veterinary experience screaming that bears don't behave this way without devastating reason. Station Supervisor Frank Henderson stumbled backward, his coffee mug shattering against concrete because in 40 years of service he'd never seen an animal display such desperate, protective fury. Jake's mind flashed to 3 years ago, Tommy's laugh echoing from this same spot before everything went dark. "Open it now," Jake commanded, his voice cracking with the weight of terrible recognition. What horror lay trapped inside that case, and how many more innocent lives hung in the balance? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The crisp Colorado morning air carried the scent of pine and impending autumn as Jake Mitchell adjusted his Forest Ranger badge for what felt like the 1,000th time. At 42, his weathered face bore the invisible scars of a man who had lost everything that mattered, yet somehow found the strength to keep protecting what remained. The small silver St. Christopher medal hanging from his neck, Tommy's first communion gift, caught the early sunlight as he moved through his morning routine at the Rocky Mountain Forest Station checkpoint. 3 years had passed since that devastating phone call that shattered his world. Tommy, his 8-year-old son with strawberry blonde hair and an infectious laugh, had been walking home from school when a drunk driver ran a red light. The funeral was a blur of condolences and casseroles, but what Jake remembered most was the deafening silence that followed. A house too quiet, a life too empty, a heart too broken to heal. That's when he found Bruno. The 6-month-old black bear cub had been discovered clinging to his dead mother's body after poachers had gunned her down for her gallbladder, worth thousands on the black market. Most rangers would have sent the orphaned cub to a zoo or rehabilitation facility, but Jake saw something in those dark, intelligent eyes that mirrored his own grief. Against all protocol and common sense, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "You and me, buddy," he had whispered to the trembling cub that first night. "We'll figure this out together." Now, 3 years later, Bruno had grown into a magnificent 400-pound American black bear, with an extraordinary gift for detecting danger that surpassed any trained dog. Their partnership was controversial, the only working bear in U.S. Forest Service history, but their success rate in wildlife protection and search and rescue operations spoke for itself. Bruno could detect injured animals from miles away, locate lost hikers through scent trails days old, and somehow sense trouble before it arrived. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the 52-year-old veterinarian who ran the nearby Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, had become their closest ally and friend. A widow herself, having lost her husband to cancer 2 years prior, she understood the healing power of interspecies bonds. She'd watched Jake slowly come back to life through his relationship with Bruno, though she worried about the day when bureaucracy might force them apart. Station Supervisor Frank Henderson, a gruff 65-year-old with kind eyes and 40 years of experience, had initially opposed Jake's unconventional partnership. But after witnessing Bruno's gentle intelligence and unwavering loyalty, Frank had become their fiercest protector within the system. Recently widowed after losing his wife to Alzheimer's, Frank found comfort in watching the unlikely family Jake and Bruno had created. "In my day, we didn't abandon family," Frank would say whenever headquarters questioned Bruno's presence. "Two-legged or four-legged?" As Jake checked his equipment that morning, Bruno padding silently beside him. Neither could have imagined that their greatest test was about to arrive in the form of a black suitcase that would force them to confront the darkest chapter of their shared past. The morning routine at the Rocky Mountain Forest Station checkpoint was proceeding normally when the sleek black SUV approached at precisely 9:47 a.m. Jake noticed it immediately, not because luxury vehicles were uncommon in this area, frequented by wealthy tourists and researchers, but because Bruno's entire demeanor shifted the moment the vehicle came into view. The bear's ears perked forward, his massive head tilting as if detecting something invisible to human senses. Professor William Hayes stepped out of the driver's seat with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to authority. At 58, he possessed the distinguished appearance of academic royalty. Silver hair, perfectly styled, expensive wool coat despite the mild weather, and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the morning light. His smile was warm and practiced as he approached Jake's station with a leather briefcase in one hand and official-looking documentation in the other. "Good morning, Ranger," Hayes said, his voice carrying the refined accent of East Coast education. "Dr. William Hayes, University of Colorado Wildlife Research Division. I'm transporting some biological samples to our Denver laboratory for analysis." He handed over a thick folder of paperwork that appeared meticulously prepared, complete with university letterhead and multiple official stamps. Jake accepted the documents, scanning them with the practiced eye of someone who'd processed thousands of such permits over the years. Everything appeared legitimate. Transport permits, university authorization, even a federal wildlife research license. Yet something felt wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what triggered his unease. That's when Bruno began to pace. The massive bear's behavior shifted from curious attention to agitated restlessness. He circled the SUV twice, his powerful nose working overtime as he investigated every surface. Jake had never seen his partner react this way to routine academic transport. Bruno typically showed mild interest in research vehicles, sometimes detecting tranquilized animals or preserved specimens, but this was different. This was personal. "Interesting companion you have there," Hayes observed, watching Bruno's behavior with what seemed like genuine scientific fascination. "I've heard rumors about the Forest Service's experimental program. Quite innovative, though I imagine controversial in some circles." "Bruno's saved more lives than most humans I know," Jake replied carefully, his instincts telling him to keep the conversation brief. "He's got a nose for trouble." As if responding to his name, Bruno suddenly stopped pacing and planted himself directly beside the SUV's rear cargo area. The bear's hackles began to rise, creating a ridge of dark fur along his massive shoulders. A low rumble emanated from deep in his chest, not quite a growl, but something far more ominous. "What's he detecting?" Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. Hayes glanced nervously at his watch, then back at the bear. "Probably just the preservation chemicals we use for specimens. Sometimes the scents can be quite strong, especially to sensitive animal noses. I really do need to reach the laboratory before noon. Time-sensitive samples, you understand." But Bruno wasn't backing down. The bear moved closer to the vehicle, his behavior escalating from curious to protective. He began making soft vocalizations. Not the aggressive sounds of a threatened bear, but something Jake had only heard a few times before. It was the same sound Bruno had made when they'd discovered that injured deer last spring, the same urgent whine he'd produced when locating the lost child during the Henderson search. It was the sound of a creature recognizing suffering. "Sir, I'm going to need to inspect your cargo," Jake announced, his years of training overriding his uncertainty. Something inside that vehicle was triggering every protective instinct his partner possessed. Hayes's demeanor shifted subtly, the polished academic facade developing hairline cracks. "Ranger, I understand your diligence, but these samples are extremely valuable and somewhat fragile. The containers are sealed under sterile conditions, and opening them could contaminate months of research work. Frank Henderson emerged from the station office, drawn by the commotion. The veteran supervisor took one look at Bruno's agitated state and Jake's tense posture, and his expression hardened. 40 years of experience had taught him to trust both his rangers and their instincts. "What's the situation?" Frank asked, positioning himself to provide backup if needed. "Academic transport with biological samples," Jake explained, never taking his eyes off Bruno. "But something's got him worked up like I've never seen." Bruno punctuated Jake's words by moving to the rear of the SUV and releasing a sound that made everyone freeze. A deep, mournful howl that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. It was a sound of recognition, of remembered trauma, of desperate need to protect something precious and vulnerable. Hayes stepped forward quickly, keys jingling in his shaking hands. "Really, gentlemen, I must insist we conclude this inspection quickly. I have colleagues waiting, and these samples truly are time-sensitive." Jake looked at Frank, then at Bruno, whose massive frame was now trembling with an emotion that looked disturbingly like grief mixed with rage. In that moment, Jake made a decision that would change everything. "Open the cargo area, Professor. Now." The rear cargo door of the SUV swung open with a metallic creak that seemed to echo through the mountain air. What Jake saw inside made his blood run cold, while Bruno's reaction confirmed his worst fears. There, nestled within a custom-fitted black suitcase lined with what appeared to be medical-grade padding, lay 3 tiny forms that shouldn't exist anywhere in the Colorado wilderness: giant panda cubs. The smallest couldn't have weighed more than a few pounds, its black and white fur matted and dull with dehydration. Its tiny chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths that spoke of extreme distress. The 2 larger cubs showed slightly better condition but were clearly suffering from prolonged confinement and inadequate care. All 3 bore the unmistakable signs of animals who had been separated from their mother far too early. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his 40 years of wildlife experience failing to provide adequate words for what they were witnessing. "Professor, you better start explaining, and you better start fast." Hayes stepped forward, his academic composure cracking under the weight of discovery. "These cubs were rescued from illegal traders in Myanmar. My research partner in Beijing contacted me urgently. They needed emergency transport to our facility for medical treatment. The paperwork is all legitimate, I assure you." But Bruno wasn't listening to explanations. The massive bear had dropped to his belly and was crawling forward with the gentle deliberation of a creature recognizing profound vulnerability. As he approached the suitcase, his massive head lowered until his nose was inches from the smallest cub. The sound that emerged from him was unlike anything Jake had ever heard, a soft maternal whine that seemed to come from some primal place of recognition and protection. Jake knelt beside his partner, his own heart breaking at the sight before them. The smallest cub's breathing was becoming more labored by the minute, and even to his untrained eye, it was clear the animal was in critical condition. "Frank, call doctor! Sarah, emergency! Tell her we need her here now." "Already on it," Frank replied, his radio crackling to life as he made the urgent call. Hayes was growing increasingly agitated, checking his watch repeatedly and glancing toward the road as if expecting someone. "Gentlemen, I understand this looks concerning, but I really must insist we proceed with the transport. These animals need specialized care that only our university facility can provide." "Like hell," Jake snapped, his protective instincts fully engaged. He'd seen enough suffering in his lifetime, from Tommy's final moments in that hospital bed to the countless animals he'd found too late to save. These cubs weren't going anywhere until he was certain of their safety. Bruno seemed to share his sentiment. The bear had positioned himself between Hayes and the suitcase, his massive bulk serving as a living barrier. Every time the professor attempted to step closer, Bruno would shift position, maintaining his protective stance without showing overt aggression. It was the behavior of a guardian, not a predator. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived within minutes, her emergency veterinary kit in hand and her face set with the grim determination of someone who'd spent decades fighting to save lives others had given up on. One look at the cubs and her professional demeanor shifted into high gear. "How long have they been in that container?" she demanded, immediately beginning her examination of the smallest cub. "The transport began yesterday evening," Hayes replied, though his answer sounded rehearsed. "We've been driving through the night to reach the facility as quickly as possible." Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she checked vital signs, examined the cubs' hydration levels, and assessed their overall condition. Her expression grew darker with each passing moment. "This is severe dehydration and hypothermia. The smallest one is in critical condition. They need immediate fluid therapy and warming protocols." "We can provide that at the university," Hayes insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "They need it now," Sarah shot back, already preparing IV supplies. "This cub won't survive another hour of transport." Bruno watched the proceedings with intense focus, occasionally offering gentle encouragement to the cubs through soft vocalizations. Jake noticed how the bears responded to Bruno's presence. Their labored breathing seemed to ease slightly when he was near, as if his calm energy provided some comfort in their distress. That's when Jake's memories began to surface. Something about Hayes seemed familiar, though he couldn't place exactly what triggered the recognition. The man's scent, perhaps, or the way he carried himself. Bruno's reaction suggested something deeper than concern for sick animals. This felt personal, territorial in a way that spoke to old wounds and unhealed trauma. "Frank," Jake said quietly, pulling his supervisor aside, "run Hayes's credentials again. Something's not adding up here." Frank nodded, understanding the gravity in Jake's voice. As he moved toward the office to make the necessary calls, Hayes's phone began ringing. The professor answered with obvious reluctance, his conversation conducted in hushed tones that nonetheless carried an edge of panic. "Yes, I understand the timeline," Hayes was saying. "There's been a minor delay, but nothing that can't be managed. No, the package is secure. I'll call you when we're mobile again." The word package sent chills down Jake's spine. These weren't research animals to Hayes, they were cargo. Bruno seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, his protective posture becoming more pronounced as he positioned himself even more deliberately between the professor and the cubs. Sarah looked up from her treatment of the smallest cub, her face pale with concern. "Jake, this animal shows signs of prolonged captivity, not recent rescue. The muscle atrophy, the behavioral responses. These cubs have been confined for weeks, possibly months." Hayes's carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel, and Bruno's behavior suggested that the bear knew far more about the professor than any of them had initially realized. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the Rocky Mountains, Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The same feeling he'd experienced the day he'd found Bruno as an orphaned cub, and the same protective fury that had driven him to save what he could when everything else had been lost. The tension at the checkpoint escalated dramatically when Frank returned from his office, his weathered face grave with troubling news. "Jake, we've got a problem. Hayes's university credentials check out, but there's no record of any authorized panda transport through our district. The Fish and Wildlife Service has no permits on file for this operation." Hayes's composure finally shattered completely. "There must be some administrative delay. These emergency transports often involve expedited paperwork that hasn't caught up with all the databases yet." His explanation sounded increasingly desperate, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Bruno's reaction to Hayes's growing agitation was immediate and alarming. The massive bear rose to his full height, every muscle in his powerful body tensing as he focused intently on the professor. A low, rumbling growl began deep in his chest, not the protective whine he'd been making toward the cubs, but something far more threatening. Jake had only heard Bruno make this sound twice before, both times when confronting genuine danger. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, but he made no move to restrain his partner. Bruno's instincts had never led them astray, and right now every fiber of the bear's being was screaming that Hayes represented a threat. "Doctor." Sarah continued working frantically to stabilize the smallest cub, whom she'd begun calling Hope in quiet moments when she thought no one was listening. The tiny panda's condition was deteriorating rapidly, her breathing becoming more labored despite Sarah's best efforts. "I need to get her to my clinic immediately. She needs equipment I don't have in my field kit." "Absolutely not," Hayes interjected, his academic mask slipping to reveal something much darker underneath. "These animals are my responsibility, and they need to reach the university facility according to my research protocol." "Your research protocol is going to kill them," Sarah snapped back, her maternal instincts fully engaged. At 52, she'd spent her entire career fighting for animals who couldn't speak for themselves, and she wasn't about to back down now. "This cub needs immediate intensive care, not another bumpy ride in the back of your SUV." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for Bruno's sudden, shocking behavior. The bear approached Hayes directly, his massive head lowering until his nose was just inches from the professor's jacket. For a moment, everyone held their breath, uncertain whether they were about to witness an attack. Instead, Bruno began the most extraordinary display of scent investigation Jake had ever witnessed. The bear's nostrils flared as he processed whatever information Hayes's clothing held. His entire body began to tremble, not with fear but with a rage so profound it seemed to emanate from his very core. When Bruno finally stepped back, the sound that emerged from him was nothing short of heartbreaking, a keening wail that spoke of recognition, betrayal, and grief so deep it seemed to crack something fundamental in the mountain air. Jake felt his own heart stop as the pieces began falling into place. Bruno's reaction wasn't just about the cubs, it was about Hayes himself. The bear had smelled something that triggered memories Jake had hoped were buried forever. Suddenly, he was transported back 3 years to that terrible day when he'd found Bruno as a traumatized cub, clinging to his mother's still warm body, the day they'd arrived too late to save her, but just in time to see a figure disappearing into the tree line. A figure Jake had never been able to identify because the man had been too far away, moving too quickly through the dense forest. But Bruno had been there. Bruno had seen everything. And Bruno's nose was telling him that the man standing before them now was the same person who had murdered his mother. "You son of a bitch," Jake whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. "You're the poacher. You killed Bruno's mother." Hayes took a step backward, his face going pale as the accusation hung in the air. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a university researcher, not some common criminal." But Bruno's behavior spoke louder than any denial. The bear moved to position himself between Hayes and the cubs, his protective stance making his intentions crystal clear. In Bruno's mind, the man who had destroyed his family was now threatening another generation of helpless babies, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. Frank's radio crackled to life, and the news it delivered sent shockwaves through the group. "All units be advised we have reports of a missing research shipment from the Denver Zoo. 3 juvenile giant pandas were reported stolen during transport yesterday evening. Suspects unknown, but the theft appears to be connected to international wildlife trafficking." The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely as he realized his lies had been exposed. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "My daughter, Caroline, is dying. The experimental treatments she needs cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Insurance won't cover them because they're considered investigational. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just needed the money to save my little girl." Sarah looked up from Hope's limp form, her eyes blazing with fury. "So you steal babies? You separate cubs from their mothers and ship them across the country in suitcases. How many other animals have suffered for your daughter's treatment?" "Caroline is all I have left," Hayes pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "Her mother died when she was born. It's been just the two of us for 22 years. When the doctors told me about the experimental gene therapy program in Switzerland, I knew I had to find a way to pay for it. These animals, they're worth $500,000 each on the private market. One sale would cover her entire treatment." Jake felt a complicated mix of emotions wash over him. As a father who had lost a child, he understood the desperate lengths a parent would go to save their baby. But looking at Bruno's traumatized response and the dying cub in Sarah's arms, he also understood that desperation didn't justify cruelty. "There had to be another way," Jake said quietly. "Fundraising, loans, selling everything you owned, anything but this." "I tried everything," Hayes sobbed. "I mortgaged my house, sold my car, emptied my retirement accounts. It wasn't enough. The treatment cost $2 million, and Caroline's condition is deteriorating rapidly. I couldn't lose her like I lost her mother." Bruno's reaction to Hayes's emotional breakdown was perhaps the most remarkable thing Jake had ever witnessed. The bear's rage seemed to transform into something else, not forgiveness, but a recognition of shared pain. Bruno had lost his mother to this man's greed, but he could also sense the genuine anguish of a father facing the loss of his child. The moment was shattered by the arrival of additional vehicles. Federal agents, alerted by Frank's earlier calls, pulled into the checkpoint with sirens wailing. Behind them came a van from the Denver Zoo, followed by what appeared to be an FBI tactical unit. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez stepped out of the lead vehicle, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene. "Professor Hayes, you're under arrest for theft of endangered species, interstate transport of stolen property, and violation of the Endangered Species Act." She began reading him his rights as other agents moved to secure the cubs and collect evidence. Hayes didn't resist arrest, his spirit seemingly broken by the weight of his confession and the reality of his situation. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he looked directly at Jake with haunted eyes. "Please tell Caroline I'm sorry. Tell her I tried to save her, but I lost myself in the process." Dr. Sarah was frantically working with the zoo veterinarians who had arrived to take custody of the cubs. Hope's condition had stabilized slightly with the advanced equipment they'd brought, but she was still critical. The other two cubs showed better vital signs, but would require weeks of rehabilitation to recover from their ordeal. As Hayes was loaded into a federal transport vehicle, Bruno watched with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. The bear had gotten justice for his mother's death, but Jake could see that the victory felt hollow. Too much damage had been done. Too many lives had been shattered by the cycle of loss and desperation that had brought them all to this moment. Frank approached Jake as they watched the convoy prepare to depart. "Hell of a thing," the old supervisor said quietly. "Man loses his wife, spends his life raising his daughter alone, then faces losing her too. Makes you wonder what any of us might do when pushed to the edge." Jake nodded, his hand resting on Bruno's massive head as they watched Hope being carefully loaded into the specialized transport unit that would take her to the intensive care facility at the Denver Zoo. The smallest cub had fought so hard to survive, just like Bruno had fought to overcome his own trauma. Sometimes the will to live was enough to overcome impossible odds, and sometimes it wasn't. But as Jake looked at his partner, the orphaned bear who had become his salvation and his family, He realized that healing wasn't just about surviving trauma. It was about choosing to protect others from experiencing the same pain, about transforming grief into purpose and loss into love. The real test would be whether any of them could find a way to break the cycle of suffering that had brought them together on this devastating afternoon in the Colorado mountains. The peaceful resolution that everyone hoped for shattered like glass 3 hours later when Hayes's phone, confiscated as evidence, began ringing incessantly in the federal agent's custody. Special Agent Martinez answered the fifth call, her expression growing increasingly grave as she listened to the voice on the other end. When she hung up, her face was pale with a new understanding of just how deep this conspiracy ran. "We have a problem," she announced to the assembled group. "That call was from Hayes's business partners. They're not happy about the delayed delivery, and they're coming to collect their merchandise personally." Jake felt his blood run cold. "How many are we talking about?" The caller mentioned a team of 6, armed and dangerous. They have Hayes's location tracked through his phone's GPS, and they're en route from Denver, ETA approximately 2 hours. Martinez turned to Frank. "We need to evacuate this facility immediately and move the cubs to a secure location." But Dr. Sarah looked up from where she was monitoring Hope's vital signs with portable equipment. "This cub can't be moved again. She's barely hanging on as it is. Another transport, even a short one, could kill her." Bruno seemed to understand the gravity of the situation without needing translation. The massive bear moved to position himself directly beside the cub's transport containers, his body language making it clear that he had no intention of allowing anyone to take them. The protective stance he adopted was eerily reminiscent of the last stand his mother had made 3 years ago. "There has to be another way," Jake insisted, his mind racing through possibilities. "We can't keep running with dying animals, and we can't abandon them to these criminals." Frank stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. "This is still my station, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let a bunch of thugs chase us off our own territory. We make our stand here." Agent Martinez shook her head firmly. "Sir, with all due respect, you're not equipped for this kind of confrontation. These people have military-grade weapons and absolutely no qualms about using them. They've killed federal agents before." "Then we call for backup," Jake said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the reality of their remote location. The nearest substantial law enforcement was hours away, and the criminals would arrive long before help could reach them. It was Bruno who provided the first hint of a solution. The bear began moving systematically around the perimeter of the checkpoint, his nose working constantly as he investigated every possible approach route. Jake had seen this behavior before during search and rescue operations. Bruno was mapping the terrain, identifying strategic positions and potential escape routes. "He's right," Jake realized suddenly. "We know this territory better than they do. Bruno and I have hiked every trail, explored every cave, mapped every defensive position in these mountains. If we're smart about this, we can use the landscape to our advantage." Dr. Sarah looked up from her patient, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "I'm not leaving Hope. Whatever plan you come up with, it has to account for the fact that I'm staying with this cub no matter what happens." The next hour was spent in frantic preparation. Frank coordinated with the limited law enforcement available, establishing a communication network that would allow them to track the approaching threat. Agent Martinez worked with her federal contacts to expedite additional support, though everyone knew it would arrive too late to prevent the initial confrontation. Jake and Bruno conducted a detailed reconnaissance of the surrounding area, identifying 3 potential defensive positions that would allow them to protect the medical facility while giving them tactical advantages. The bear's intimate knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable. He led Jake to hidden approach routes and elevated positions that would have taken hours to locate without his guidance. As the afternoon wore on, the emotional toll of the situation began weighing heavily on everyone involved. Sarah worked tirelessly to stabilize Hope, her maternal instincts driving her to extraordinary efforts to save the tiny life in her care. Frank coordinated defenses with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too much violence in his 4 decades of service. Jake found himself checking and rechecking his equipment, the weight of responsibility for everyone's safety pressing down on him like a physical burden. Bruno's behavior during this time was perhaps the most remarkable of all. Despite the approaching danger, the bear remained calm and focused, moving between his human companions and the cubs with a sense of purpose that seemed almost supernatural. He would spend time lying beside Hope's transport container, his massive presence somehow providing comfort to the dying cub, then patrol the perimeter with Jake, his senses alert for any sign of the approaching threat. The call that changed everything came at 4:30 p.m. Agent Martinez's phone rang, and the voice on the other end belonged to Hayes himself, calling from federal custody. "They're not just coming for the cubs," Hayes said, his voice thick with guilt and fear. "I heard them talking before you arrested me. They're planning to eliminate everyone who can identify them. They can't afford witnesses, especially law enforcement witnesses." The weight of this revelation settled over the group like a shroud. This wasn't just about recovering stolen animals anymore. It was about survival. Jake looked at Bruno, remembering the day 3 years ago when they had first found each other in the aftermath of tragedy. The bear had lost his family to these same criminal networks, and now history was threatening to repeat itself. But this time, they weren't helpless victims. This time, they had each other, and they had the home field advantage. "We're not running," Jake announced, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of a man who had already lost too much to compromise again. "These mountains are our home, Bruno's home. We protect what's ours." Frank nodded slowly, understanding the deeper implications of Jake's words. "In my day, we didn't abandon family," he said, echoing the philosophy that had guided his entire career. "Two-legged or four-legged?" Dr. Sarah looked up from her patient, her eyes bright with tears, but her voice steady. "Hope is responding to treatment. Her vital signs are stabilizing. If we can protect her for just a few more hours, I think she'll make it." As if understanding the conversation, Bruno moved to the center of the group and sat down, his massive frame serving as a living symbol of their resolve. The bear, who had survived the loss of his mother, who had overcome trauma and learned to trust again, who had devoted his life to protecting others, was ready to make his final stand. The sun was beginning to set over the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows across the checkpoint that had become their fortress. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard echoing through the valleys, growing steadily louder as their enemies drew near. Jake checked his rifle one final time, then knelt beside Bruno and placed his hand on the bear's massive head. "You ready for this, partner?" Bruno's response was a low rumble of determination that seemed to vibrate through the mountain air. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else since that terrible day when they had first found each other in the aftermath of loss and decided to build something better from the ruins of their broken hearts. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of 3 stolen cubs, but the future of an unlikely family that had chosen to stand together against impossible odds. The attack came at dusk, just as the mountain shadows were growing long and the temperature was beginning to drop. Jake heard the vehicles before he saw them, 3 black SUVs moving in coordinated formation up the mountain road, their engines echoing off the canyon walls like thunder before a storm. Bruno's ears perked up immediately, his massive head turning toward the sound with the focused intensity of a predator recognizing a threat. "They're here," Jake whispered into his radio, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. From his elevated position behind a cluster of boulders 50 yards from the checkpoint, he had a clear view of the approaching convoy while remaining hidden from sight. Agent Martinez's voice crackled back through the radio. "Remember, our primary objective is protecting the Cubs and Dr. Sarah. Everything else is secondary." The lead vehicle came to a stop just outside the checkpoint perimeter, and 6 men emerged with military precision. They were dressed in tactical gear and carried automatic weapons with the casual familiarity of professionals. Their leader, a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes, surveyed the scene with calculating intelligence. "Professor Hayes," the leader called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "We know you're here. Come out now, and we can discuss this like civilized businessmen. Keep hiding, and we'll burn this whole place down to find you." Frank's voice came from the checkpoint office, amplified by the station's loudspeaker system. "Hayes is in federal custody. You men are trespassing on government property. Leave now, and we'll consider this a misunderstanding." The leader's laugh was devoid of humor. "Federal custody? That's unfortunate for the professor, but it doesn't change our business arrangement. We have 3 very valuable assets to collect, and we're not leaving without them." Jake watched through his rifle scope as the men began spreading out, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse, they were experienced operators with a clear tactical plan. 2 men moved toward the office building where Frank was positioned. 2 others headed for the medical facility where Dr. Sarah was treating Hope, and the remaining 2 began a systematic search of the immediate area. "Bruno," Jake whispered to his partner, who was crouched beside him in the gathering darkness. "Remember what we practiced. Stay low, stay quiet, and trust your nose." The bear nodded once, a gesture so human-like it never failed to amaze Jake. Bruno began moving silently through the underbrush, his massive frame somehow managing to remain nearly invisible as he flanked around to the left side of the checkpoint. Years of working together had taught them to operate as a seamless team, and tonight would be the ultimate test of their partnership. The first shots rang out when the mercenaries reached the medical facility. "Doctor?" Sarah's scream of defiance echoed across the mountains as she refused to abandon Hope, even with automatic weapons pointed at her. "You'll have to kill me first," she shouted, her voice carrying the fierce determination of a mother protecting her child. Jake's world narrowed to the scope of his rifle as he lined up his first shot. The mercenary threatening Sarah never saw it coming. One moment he was advancing with his weapon raised, the next he was collapsing to the ground with a precision shot to his shoulder that left him alive but neutralized. The remaining attackers immediately took cover, their professional training evident in their rapid response to incoming fire. But Jake and Bruno had the advantage of knowing every inch of this terrain, every boulder and tree that could provide cover or concealment. Bruno made his move when the second mercenary attempted to breach the medical facility. The bear emerged from the shadows like a force of nature, his 400-pound frame colliding with the armed man with devastating effect. The mercenary's weapon went flying as he found himself face to face with an angry bear whose protective instincts had been fully activated. "What the hell was that?" one of the remaining attackers shouted, his voice carrying a note of panic that suggested they hadn't been briefed about the checkpoint's unusual security arrangements. Frank's voice boomed across the checkpoint from his fortified position. "That's Bruno, and he doesn't much like folks who threaten his family." The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly for the attackers as they realized they were facing not just human opponents, but a coordinated defense that included a trained bear with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Bruno moved through the darkness like a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will, creating chaos and confusion among men who were accustomed to controlling every variable in their operations. Jake continued providing precise covering fire from his elevated position, each shot carefully calculated to neutralize threats without creating additional danger for his allies. His years of military training, combined with his intimate knowledge of these mountains, gave him advantages that the mercenaries couldn't overcome despite their superior firepower. The leader of the attackers made a fatal tactical error when he decided to use hope as leverage. Advancing on the medical facility with his weapon drawn, he called out to the defenders, "Enough games! I'm going in there, and I'm taking what belongs to us. Anyone who tries to stop me will watch that little panda die first." It was a threat that sealed his fate. Bruno, who had been moving through the shadows like a predator stalking prey, emerged from concealment with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. The bear's protective fury was a sight to behold. 400 pounds of muscle and righteous anger focused on eliminating a threat to the cubs he had claimed as family. The mercenary leader had perhaps 3 seconds to process what was happening before Bruno was upon him. The man's weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as he found himself overwhelmed by a force of nature that no amount of tactical training could have prepared him for. Jake watched through his scope as the remaining attackers, faced with the collapse of their tactical advantage and the terrifying reality of combat with an enraged bear, began a fighting retreat toward their vehicles. 2 were already down from Jake's precise shots, 1 was being mauled by Bruno, and the survivors were discovering that their military-grade weapons were less effective against mountain terrain and a coordinated defense than they had anticipated. But even as victory seemed within reach, Jake felt a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. In all the chaos and confusion of the firefight, he had lost track of one crucial element: the safety of the cubs themselves. Hope was still fighting for her life in that medical facility, and the violence swirling around her could easily prove fatal to a creature already balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. The battle was far from over, and the price of victory was still to be determined. The gunshot that shattered the mountain evening air came from inside the medical facility, followed immediately by Dr. Sarah's anguished scream that cut through Jake's soul like a blade. In that terrible moment, time seemed to freeze as the implications of what he had just heard crashed over him with devastating clarity. The sound wasn't the sharp crack of a rifle or the rapid staccato of automatic weapons. It was the heavy, final boom of a close-range shot from inside the building where Hope lay fighting for her life. "Sarah!" Jake shouted into his radio, abandoning his sniper position and scrambling down the rocky slope with reckless desperation. "Sarah, respond!" Bruno's reaction was even more immediate and violent. The massive bear released the mercenary leader he had been subduing and charged toward the medical facility with a roar of pure anguish that echoed off the canyon walls. In that moment, Jake realized that Bruno understood exactly what that gunshot meant. Another innocent life had been taken by the same evil that had destroyed his mother. Jake reached the facility first, bursting through the door with his rifle ready, only to find a scene that stopped his heart completely. "Doctor." Sarah sat on the floor beside Hope's transport container, her veterinary coat soaked with blood, her hands pressed against a wound in her shoulder. But it wasn't her injury that made Jake's world tilt on its axis. It was the sight of Hope's tiny, motionless form lying outside her container, a spreading pool of crimson beneath her small body. "No, no, no!" Sarah was sobbing, her professional composure completely shattered. "I tried to shield her. When he came through the window, I tried to protect her, but the bullet—" Her voice broke as the full horror of what had happened overwhelmed her ability to speak. The 6th mercenary, the one Jake had lost track of during the firefight, lay unconscious near the overturned medical equipment, his weapon several feet away. Blood trickled from his temple where Sarah had apparently managed to strike him with a piece of medical equipment after being shot, but his single bullet had already done its devastating work. Bruno entered the facility behind Jake. and the sound that emerged from the bear when he saw Hope's lifeless form was unlike anything Jake had ever heard. It was a keening wail of grief so profound it seemed to come from the deepest places of the earth itself. The massive bear approached the tiny panda cub with trembling steps, his great head lowering until his nose was just inches from her still form. For several heart-beating moments, Bruno simply stood vigil over Hope's body, his massive frame shaking with what could only be described as grief. Jake watched his partner experience the same devastating loss that had shaped both their lives, the helpless anguish of arriving too late to save an innocent life that had depended on their protection. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his own voice thick with tears as he knelt beside Bruno. "I'm so sorry, buddy. We tried." But even as they mourned, the practical reality of their situation demanded action. The other two cubs were still alive and needed protection, and Dr. Sarah required immediate medical attention for her gunshot wound. Frank's voice crackled over the radio with urgent updates from his position at the checkpoint office. "Jake, we've got more vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like reinforcements. The surviving attackers must have called for backup before retreating." Agent Martinez's voice cut through the static with grim authority. "Federal backup is still 40 minutes out. We need to establish a more defensible position immediately." Jake looked at Sarah, who was struggling to apply pressure to her shoulder wound while refusing to leave Hope's body. "Can you move?" he asked gently. "I won't leave her," Sarah said firmly, her maternal instincts overriding her physical pain. "That baby fought so hard to live. Someone has to stay with her." It was Bruno who provided the solution. The massive bear carefully, gently, picked up Hope's small body in his massive jaws, carrying her with the same tender care a mother bear would show her own cub. Jake understood immediately. They would take Hope with them to the more secure position, ensuring that even in death, she would not be abandoned to the criminals who had caused her suffering. The retreat to the secondary defensive position was a nightmare of coordination under fire. The approaching vehicles contained at least 8 more armed mercenaries, and their tactics had evolved based on the lessons learned from the first assault. They were no longer underestimating the defensive capabilities of their targets, and they were operating with the ruthless efficiency of professionals who had been backed into a corner. Frank, despite his 65 years, moved with the tactical awareness of his military background as he coordinated the defensive withdrawal. Agent Martinez provided covering fire while Jake helped support the wounded Dr. Sarah. Bruno carried Hope's body while somehow managing to maintain his protective awareness of the remaining living cubs, who were being transported in their medical containers by federal agents. The new defensive position was a natural rock formation that Jake and Bruno had identified during their earlier reconnaissance. It provided excellent sight lines while offering protection from multiple approach routes, and it had the added advantage of being accessible to vehicles in case they needed to evacuate the cubs quickly. But as they settled into their defensive positions, the full scope of their enemy's determination became clear. The mercenaries had brought night vision equipment, heavy weapons, and what appeared to be military-grade communication systems. They were operating with the resources and coordination of a well-funded international organization, not the desperate improvisation of common criminals. "This is bigger than just Hayes and his stolen cubs," Agent Martinez observed grimly as she watched the mercenaries establish their assault positions through binoculars. "These people have the equipment and training of a military unit." Jake was beginning to understand the true scope of what they were facing. Hayes had described needing money for his daughter's treatment, but the resources being deployed to recover 3 panda cubs suggested that far more was at stake than the professor had revealed. This was part of a larger criminal enterprise, one that treated endangered animals as commodities and viewed anyone who interfered with their operations as expendable obstacles. The revelation came when Frank's radio picked up communications between the attacking forces. The mercenaries were speaking in coded language, but their intent was chillingly clear. They were not planning to leave any witnesses to their activities. Hayes had been right when he warned that they would eliminate everyone who could identify them. "They're not just here for the cubs," Frank announced to the group. "They're here to clean up loose ends, all of us." Dr. Sarah looked up from where she was treating her wound with supplies from the emergency medical kit. "How many innocent animals have died because of people like this? How many families have been destroyed?" Bruno seemed to understand the conversation even without words. The bear positioned himself at the front of their defensive position, his massive frame serving as a living barrier between the criminals and the cubs they were trying to protect. His eyes never left Hope's small body, which he had placed carefully beside the transport containers holding her surviving siblings. Jake checked his ammunition and surveyed their tactical situation with the practiced eye of someone who had faced impossible odds before. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had advantages their enemies couldn't match. Intimate knowledge of the terrain, the tactical support of a trained bear, and the desperate motivation of people protecting their family. The second assault began at full darkness, with the mercenaries using their night vision advantage to coordinate a multi-pronged attack. But Bruno's enhanced senses provided early warning of their approach, and the defensive position Jake had chosen neutralized many of their technological advantages. As gunfire erupted across the mountain landscape once again, Jake found himself thinking about Tommy, about the random drunk driver who had stolen his son's future in a moment of selfish stupidity. Now he was facing another group of people who viewed innocent lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of their own goals. But this time, he wasn't powerless. This time, he had Bruno beside him, and together they were going to make sure that Hope's death would not be in vain. The surviving cubs would live, and the criminals responsible for so much suffering would face justice. The battle for the Rocky Mountain checkpoint was far from over, but Jake and Bruno were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting to ensure that the cycle of loss and grief that had brought them together would finally come to an end. The dawn that broke over the Rocky Mountains 3 months later painted the sky in shades of hope that Jake Mitchell had never thought he would see again. He stood on the porch of his expanded cabin, watching as Bruno played gently with the 2 surviving panda cubs in their specially constructed outdoor enclosure. The scene should have been impossible. A 400-pound American black bear serving as surrogate parent to endangered Chinese pandas. But love, Jake had learned, often transcended the boundaries that logic tried to impose. The night of the final confrontation had ended not with a blaze of gunfire, but with the arrival of a full federal task force that had been tracking the international wildlife trafficking ring for over 2 years. Hayes's arrest had provided the final piece of evidence needed to bring down an operation that spanned 3 continents and had been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of endangered animals. The mercenaries who had attacked the checkpoint were now facing federal charges that would keep them imprisoned for decades. Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She had taken Jake's last name when they married 6 weeks ago in a simple ceremony attended by Frank, Bruno, and the 2 surviving cubs, emerged from the cabin carrying a steaming cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. Her left shoulder still bore the scar from the gunshot wound she had received protecting Hope, but she wore it with pride rather than shame. Some wounds, she had told Jake, were worth carrying because they represented the moments when you chose to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. The article about Bruno made the front page of the Denver Post, she said, settling into the chair beside Jake and handing him the newspaper. The headline read, "Hero Bear Saves Endangered Species, Unlikely partnership brings down international trafficking ring. Jake smiled as he read the article, though his expression grew more serious when he reached the section about hope. The reporters had captured the bittersweet nature of their victory. 2 cubs saved, but at the cost of a third life that had been too fragile to survive the violence that surrounded her rescue. Hope's death had become a rallying cry for stronger enforcement of wildlife protection laws, and her story had inspired donations to conservation efforts from around the world. "Any word from Professor Hayes?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer would likely be the same as it had been for the past month. "He writes every week," Jake replied, pulling a letter from his shirt pocket. "Caroline is responding well to the new treatment protocol." The federal prosecutors worked out a deal where the money from his seized assets went directly to pay for her care, and she's been accepted into a clinical trial that doesn't require the kind of funding he was trying to raise illegally. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Hayes's desperate attempt to save his daughter through criminal activity had ultimately led to her receiving better care than he could have provided through illegal means. The federal government's seizure of his assets had been redirected to fund Caroline's treatment as part of his plea agreement, and the publicity around the case had brought her situation to the attention of researchers who were conducting cutting-edge genetic therapy trials. "He wants to visit Bruno when he gets out of prison," Jake continued. "Says he needs to apologize in person to the bear whose mother he killed." Sarah shook her head with a mixture of wonder and concern. "Do you think Bruno would accept that kind of closure?" Before Jake could answer, Bruno himself provided a response of sorts. The massive bear looked up from where he was gently grooming one of the cubs and made eye contact with Jake across the distance. In that moment, Jake saw something in his partner's expression that he had never seen before. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace that suggested the deep wounds of the past were finally beginning to heal. Frank Henderson arrived at precisely 9 a.m., as he had every morning since his official retirement 6 weeks ago. The former station supervisor had discovered that retirement didn't suit him nearly as well as he had expected, and he had thrown himself into helping establish the new wildlife education center that had grown up around Jake and Sarah's unconventional family. "Morning, you two," Frank called out as he approached the porch. "The school group from Denver is arriving at 10, and the wildlife photographer from National Geographic is coming this afternoon for the big story they're putting together." The transformation of the remote checkpoint into a legitimate wildlife education center had been Sarah's idea, born from her observation that Bruno's gentle interactions with the cubs had a profound effect on everyone who witnessed them. What had started as a temporary arrangement to care for the rescued pandas had evolved into something much larger, a place where people could learn about conservation while witnessing the remarkable bonds that could form between different species. "How are our boys doing this morning?" Frank asked, referring to the 2 surviving cubs who had officially been named Courage and Resilience by a nationwide contest that had drawn over 100,000 entries from school children. "Courage is putting on weight exactly as he should be," Sarah reported with the professional satisfaction of a veterinarian whose patients were thriving. "Resilience is still smaller than we'd like, but he's gaining strength every day. The specialists from the Denver Zoo think they'll both be ready for the reintroduction program in China within the next year." The mention of reintroduction brought a familiar pang of bittersweet emotion to Jake's chest. The goal had always been to prepare the cubs for eventual return to their natural habitat, but the bonds that had formed over the past 3 months made the prospect of separation increasingly difficult to contemplate. Bruno, in particular, had assumed the role of surrogate parent with such devotion that it was hard to imagine him accepting the cubs' departure. "There's something else we need to discuss," Frank said, his tone growing more serious. "I got a call from Washington this morning. The director of the Fish and Wildlife Service wants to officially recognize Bruno's service with a special commendation. Apparently, The publicity around our story has inspired Congress to increase funding for wildlife protection programs. Jake felt a surge of pride on behalf of his partner. Bruno had gone from being a controversial exception to federal policy to becoming the poster child for innovative conservation approaches. Universities were studying their partnership, other agencies were considering similar programs, and Bruno had become probably the most famous bear in America. But more importantly to Jake, Bruno had found peace. The traumatized cub, who had lost his mother to human greed, had grown into a protector whose courage and intelligence had saved countless lives. The cycle of violence and loss that had brought them together had been transformed into something beautiful and redemptive. Sarah stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, watching as Bruno carefully supervised the cub's breakfast routine. "You know what I love most about watching him with them?" she asked. "He's not trying to replace their mother or pretend to be something he's not. He's just being present for them, offering protection and comfort in whatever way he can." Jake joined her at the railing, understanding the deeper meaning behind her observation. Both he and Bruno had learned the same difficult lesson over the past 3 months. You couldn't replace what had been lost, but you could choose to love what remained. Tommy would always be gone, Hope would always be dead, and their mothers would always have been taken too soon. But courage and resilience were alive, Sarah was healing, and the family they had created together was proof that even the deepest wounds could eventually become sources of strength rather than weakness. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of the day's first group of visitors, 34th graders from a Denver elementary school who had raised money for wildlife conservation after hearing Bruno's story on the news. Jake watched as their teacher organized them into a respectful line, their young faces bright with excitement at the prospect of meeting the famous bear. "Remember what we talked about on the bus?" the teacher was saying. "Bruno is a wild animal who has learned to trust humans, but we show our respect by being quiet and following all of Mr. Mitchell's instructions." As Jake prepared to begin the educational presentation that had become his new calling, he reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken since that morning when Bruno had first detected the smuggled cubs. He had found love with Sarah, purpose in education and conservation, and a peace with Tommy's memory that he had never thought possible. Bruno seemed to sense the arrival of the children, and he moved the cubs to a position where they would be visible but safe from the excited energy of 30 young visitors. The bear's intelligence and emotional awareness never ceased to amaze Jake. He understood that these children represented the future of conservation, and he was willing to tolerate their presence for the greater good of the mission they all shared. "Welcome to the Rocky Mountain Wildlife Education Center," Jake began, his voice carrying across the crisp morning air to the gathered children. "My name is Jake Mitchell, and this is my partner Bruno. We'd like to tell you a story about courage, loss, and the amazing things that can happen when different species choose to take care of each other." As he spoke, Jake caught sight of Sarah setting up her veterinary demonstration station, Frank organizing the educational materials they would need for the day, and Bruno positioning himself protectively between the visitors and the cubs. This unlikely family that had been forged in crisis and tragedy had become something none of them could have imagined when they first met in desperation and grief. The story Jake was about to tell the children would focus on conservation and the importance of protecting endangered species. But the deeper truth was simpler and more profound. Sometimes, the greatest tragedies led to the most beautiful redemptions, and love, whether between humans, between species, or between broken hearts learning to heal together, was always stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains stood eternal and magnificent. Having witnessed the entire drama that had brought them all together, they had seen loss and found hope, had experienced the worst of human cruelty and the best of human courage, and had discovered that family was not defined by blood or species, but by the willingness to stand together when everything else fell apart. As Bruno began his gentle demonstration of interspecies care for the fascinated children, Jake realized that they had all found their way home at last. Sometimes life hands us losses so devastating we think we'll never smile again. Jake thought his world ended when he lost his 8-year-old son, Tommy. Sarah believed her purpose died with her husband's last breath. But in the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by orphaned cubs fighting for survival, they discovered something beautiful. Love doesn't divide when you share it. It multiplies. When Jake found Bruno, a traumatized bear cub clinging to his murdered mother, neither could imagine they'd become each other's salvation. 3 years later, their bond would save endangered panda cubs and expose an international trafficking ring. But more importantly, it taught them that family isn't about replacing what you've lost. It's about opening your heart to what still needs saving. Sarah found her maternal calling caring for helpless animals. Frank discovered retirement meant new beginnings, not endings. Jake learned that protecting others honored Tommy's memory better than grieving alone. At 55, 60, or 68, your most meaningful chapter might still be waiting. Your accumulated wisdom, your capacity for love, your lifetime of experience, these aren't diminishing assets, they're superpowers waiting to transform both your life and someone else's. What unexpected family has brought meaning to your later years? How have you discovered that your greatest losses led to your most beautiful second chances? Share your story in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.